Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. On today's show, we'll be discussing the G20 summit in Argentina and how it's been overshadowed by a number of global realities. The US-China trade war, the Russia-Ukraine clash, as well as others. On the sidelines, Trump signed a new free trade deal with Canada and Mexico, yet played hardball with China. He's refused to meet Putin, citing Russia's naval clash with Ukraine. To discuss those issues in detail, we're firstly joined by Einar Tangen, who is joining us live from Beijing in China, and he is a political and economic affairs commentator. Thank you for taking your time out to speak to us in the Scope. What do you make, Einar, of the issue of the China-US trade issues right now? There was some hope going into this summit that that issue would be resolved. Do you think that's still the case?
Well, I think everybody is hoping that something will be resolved. The problem is that Donald Trump has been very mixed in his messages. He sent warships through the Taiwan Straits last week. He has brought along Peter Navarro, who is a avowed China hawk. Also Lighthizer, who is also a very, very down on China. There has been very little negotiation prior to this, and generally when something is going to happen, rather than issuing threats and vague promises, I may not type rhetoric, you would generally say that our people have been working on this, we're making progress, but that has not been part of Donald Trump's rhetoric. So it's hard to know exactly how he's going to do it. From China's perspective, they believe that they have put on the table a number of times, at least twice before, deals that they thought the administration would accept, only to have them thrown back in their face within a day or two afterwards, generally in some sort of tweeted message by Donald Trump. So at this point, it's very hard to see how this can work. But everyone is hoping that it will, not only for the sake of these two countries, but for the rest of the world, which represents 60% of GDP, and who are in pins and needles as Donald Trump's actions threaten to basically bring about a recession in the next 14 to 16 months.
You know, Einar, one of the issues when it comes to China, specifically on trade, even those who have not sided with Trump in the past politically say that he does have a point when it comes to the fact that the trade between the two countries is unfair in the sense of China takes advantage, is the word used sometimes, of the U.S. It has unfair trade practices. There is intellectual property theft, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of very serious accusations, as you well know. What do you make of those?
Well, the accusations are there, but I mean, where are the cases? They talk about intellectual property theft, but the fact is there's intellectual property theft going on all over the world. If you went into the courts of the United States and started looking at Apple, Intel, Nvidia, all of these large groups, they are constantly suing each other for private intellectual property theft. To the extent that there's spying going on, I believe that the U.S., we do our fair share of this. We've famously intercepted Merkel's phone and her messages to figure out what her trade stance was. We do engage in a great deal of espionage, some of which we admit, some of which we do not. But we always claim that it's not for any kind of economic gain. I think the facts would belie that. I think if you look closely at what Snowden revealed and the other whistleblowers, it's quite clear that the scope and reach of the information that is available extends to all aspects of individual and corporate knowledge. You may recall a few years ago, there was a scandal because the CIA had put a program on all of these Seagate hard drives, which were inserted into all these computers, laptops, and desktops around the world. This is not uncommon. I think it probably is being done by other countries. So to a certain extent, it looks a little bit hypocritical on that fact. In terms of taking unfair advantage, from the Chinese perspective, they look at this at WTO, when China entered in 1991, they were beset with the most onerous terms that any country had. So they tended to look at this document as something of a legal document. They followed it to the letter. They have abided by all WTO rulings. And to that extent, they believe that anything that goes outside the scope of that was fair game, since this was in essence something that they were forced to do, swallow their pride and accept these terms. So it's not surprising that there is some feeling that somehow China has not obeyed the spirit law. Now, for Donald Trump, a man who has gone bankrupt 5 times, I don't think that we can really say that he can talk about the spirit of any kind of agreement. He's a famously tough negotiator and is always willing to walk away from anything that he can. In terms of this demonization of China in the press, that they somehow have done untoward things, as I said, where are the cases? This is often said, but very few times proven.
All right, let me add another voice to this conversation. We're also joined by Mark Sleboda, who is an international affairs and security analyst, and he's joining us live now from Moscow in Russia. Mark, thank you for taking time out to speak to us in the scope. Mark, as you well know about the G20 summit, a number of issues overshadowing that summit, such as this issue, of course, of the clash with Ukraine on the Kerch Strait. What do you make of that and the fact that Donald Trump has canceled the meeting with President Putin?
I think, thanks for having me, first of all. I think this incident of this attempt by Ukrainian naval forces to create a political provocation for domestic political reasons, ignoring protocols that they are treaty to for entering the Kerch Strait, I think it has far more to do with the West-back putsch, quote, president, unquote, Poroshenko's approval rating, which is about 8%, going into re-elections in 4 months, more than it is anything to do with relations, with Russia and in the broader scope there. This is in the martial law that was implemented specifically in the regions of the country where Poroshenko's support is essentially zero, doubled down on that. The West's reaction to this is predictable. They will do anything to support the West-backed putsch regime that has seized power in that country since 2014. If their oligarch puppet said that Putin was attacking Ukraine with snow in the winter, they would be condemning Putin for controlling the weather.
So Mark, if I'm correct, I just wanted to clarify your point of view on this. Do you think then, as the Russians have said, that the Ukrainian ships were trespassing? Because obviously when it comes to the issue of Crimea, there is a part of the world, as you well know, that does not accept what they would call the annexation of that territory.
Yeah, well, first of all, full disclosure, my wife is actually Crimean, and I have family there and across East Ukraine. So they kind of object to the term annexation when they voted, freely by vast majority to get out of Dodge after the West, instigated a putsch to overthrow the government that they had democratically elected to that country. The incident there, it's not so much about trespassing.
Okay.
Obviously, the Kerch Strait, both sides of the Kerch Straits are Russian territorial waters. But there is a treaty signed by Ukraine and Russia in 2003 that governs use of the sea. It's internal free waters for both countries. Both countries have the right to use it. But there is a specific protocol for entering the straits that requires both countries' ships to contact the Kerch authorities, receive discussions. It's a very shallow and dangerous sea, and it's very complex to enter. It's a specific protocol. Ukrainian ships, commercial and military, had gone back and forth every day for the last 4 years following that protocol. The fact that that protocol was not followed on this particular occasion shows that it was a political provocation designed to, create a security response that had to be taken because of Ukrainian threats to the bridge spanning the Kerch Straits from Crimea to mainland Russia.
Okay, so
the reaction of Trump and to all of this, again, that is the popular reason for this. But however, Putin met with European leaders. I think that Trump's real reason for not meeting with Putin during this, first of all, is that their interests are at loggerhead, but has far more to do with domestic political reasons.
And I'm glad you made that point, Mark, which I wanted to put out to our other guests as well, because that's something that I wanted to Einar. And I wanted to connect the issue of the China, the issue of trade with China with this issue with Russia, Einar, because Maria Zakharova, the Russian foreign ministry spokeswoman, said that the fact that Trump is not meeting Putin, as Mark there mentioned as well, is for domestic reasons. And as we know, right now, Donald Trump has that Mueller investigation going on vis-a-vis any possible Russian collusion, alleged Russian collusion. Do you also think that this issue over trade with China, to an extent, is also a domestic issue where Donald Trump is trying to ensure that America First narrative, which he sold himself on, is something that his voter base still signs on to?
Well, I mean, there are many people who believe that he runs the country like he ran his reality show, The Apprentice. But I think there is a kernel of something that is not contained in that. And that is, Trump was convinced by people around him, Bannon and his ilk, that the U.S. was at an inflection point. That unless it used its superior economic, political, and military power at this point, and basically reshaped the world around it, it would in essence lose that chance, and therefore the ability to lead the world or force the world into a situation of liberal democratic capitalism. Now, this is that whole American exceptionalism argument that was put forth by Francis Fukuyama. It's not something that I adhere to, but it's obviously something that those around Donald Trump believe in and have somehow convinced him. So this idea of putting China down is connected to this idea that any multilateral organization is bad unless it has Trump's name on it or it's a bilateral negotiation. I mean, to put it simply, what he would like to see is the United States at the center of the world, call it the hub. And then each spoke going out to every country in the world would be a bilateral trade agreement and security agreement. That would, in essence, allow the U.S. to use its superior powers to get the best terms. From a real estate perspective, this is what you call getting everything that's on.
At this point, when we're talking about specifically the issue of China, Einar, there are concerns that economists have brought up that the Chinese economy may slow at this point in time because of these trade issues with the United States. What is the feeling like in the country itself?
It's absolutely true. I mean, despite some very positive economic news today saying that through the last 9 months, trade has actually expanded by 15%. There's a feeling that a lot of that is stockpiling at this point. If you go down into other areas of China, you'll find that a lot of small companies are really, really struggling. They can barely take the 10% tariff. If it goes up to 25%, they're in very difficult way. Unlike foreign companies who are here who can pick up and go somewhere else, the current currency restrictions within China make it very difficult for Chinese companies to go abroad, even if they have a market. But this economic displacement is not only happening in China, it's also happening in the U.S. We've already seen GM say they're going to get rid of 15,000 people. And all the components that are coming into U.S. companies, small, medium, and large, that are going into products, if those products are being sold in the U.S., they're more expensive. They're trying to being exported to China, they're more expensive. If they're being exported around the world, they're more expensive. So what I'm saying is that U.S. goods are becoming prohibitively more expensive and that they're going to lose out to the competition, probably mostly in Europe.
Right.
For China, this kind of situation is very difficult. No one in China is saying that this is a win-win situation or that China will win. They just say that we will suffer the consequences of maintaining an independent policy.
Okay, so Mark, I want to put that to you because that last phrase that Einar there just used in sort of independent policy, is that something that, do you think Russia is sticking by that as well, regardless of the cost to it? Because we know that Russia has been sanctioned as well over the issue of Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, Russia obviously does not accept economic blackmail or warfare in contravention of every principle of the World Trade Organization. Both countries, are a party to, to change its foreign policy course, to match Western hegemonic interests. It's simply not going to happen on anything. I mean, the entire history of using sanctions on nearly every country, unilaterally when conducted by the United States is a showcase of a foreign policy of failure, a foreign policy of the need to do something. And sanctions have never been an effective tool for anything. But it's hardly just Russia and China. I mean, the Trump administration has, whether through sanctions, or tariffs or the threats of tariffs, the Trump administration has basically declared economic war on the entire world in an attempt to leverage what economic and military superpower the United States has left into, changing a course of the transfer of global wealth from west to east that is occurring, at the expense of the United States through the architecture that they set up, to govern global financial and economic relations. So, this is where Russia and China sit today. They're simply not going to accept economic dictates from the U.S. Especially when it comes to their foreign policy and their vital and legitimate national security interests.
Einar, do you agree with that? Do you think that this is economic warfare of sorts? And B, then how far is China willing to go, or even let's just make the grouping China, Russia, and possibly others as well. How far do you think this grouping of countries that are being targeted are willing to go in standing up for themselves? Because again, as I mentioned earlier, there is this concern that their own economies will slow.
Well, I don't think there's much question that this is economic warfare. I mean, the unilateral imposition of tariffs against friend and foe would seem to indicate that the U.S., as my colleague has indicated, is embarking on a America first, use all power necessary to gain the maximum advantage strategy. Now, in terms of the rest of the world, people keep concentrating on what's happening with the United States and China. I would disagree with that. 60% of the world's GDP is all the rest of the world. And where they go and how they see this, whether they want to be part of this American exceptionalist world that is being pushed by Donald Trump, where they will be, in some cases, reduced to vassal states, or whether they want to band together and create a multilateral world where they can all prosper, that is going to be up to them.
One of the interesting things that I found at this G20 summit, Einar, is the fact that right before it began, Donald Trump sat down with Justin Trudeau and the Mexican president, and they've signed that deal, that free trade deal, a replacement, of course, of NAFTA. And this is the same time that he's still having this trade row with China. What did you make of the fact that, to me at least, it seems like mixed messages?
Well, it's all optics. I mean, you'll note that everyone else signed in pen. He seized a big black magic marker and made sure that the only thing you could actually make out was his own name as he held it out there. It's showmanship. It's part of what he does. But if you start looking at the new NAFTA, first off, it has 3 different names, depending on whether you're in the U.S., Mexico, or in Canada. Second, it's a worse off deal than the U.S. would have had if they had gone forward with TPP. Remember, NAFTA was going to fade away because TPP was going to replace it. So that did not happen. Trump walks away from that deal, and then he basically negotiates a watered-down deal, which doesn't give him as much as he would have had under TPP. So most economists, people looking at this, are scratching their head. The only thing they can come up with is that he wanted to put his name on whatever agreement was out there and to erase any vestige of the history. It seems to be a very, very consistent theme with him. If it doesn't have his name or mark on it, he does not like it. And this goes to almost all international organizations, from the UN, the WTO, climate change, the treaty with Iran, the nuclear treaty with short and medium missile treaty with Russia. He's become unreliable, and this is part of that. So this showmanship of showing that he somehow conquered his two neighbors is not going to sit well, neither with the people nor the leadership. You know, the world is a funny place.
Okay.
Today you're on top of it. Tomorrow you're on your way down. And on your way down, the people you were not so nice to are going to remember.
Indeed, Mark, I'm glad Einar brought up that missile treaty, because that's an important one. And I know that Russia has brought that up a number of times with the United States with some concern. Why do you think it is that Donald Trump is walking away from so many of these treaties, or at least seemingly walking away? Is it, as Einar said, Mark, about Donald Trump wanting his own name essentially attached to whatever replaces these treaties?
Well, I mean, no one has any question that Trump has an enormous ego, and that has to be factored into the motivation, of everything that he does to a certain extent. But he does have, a legitimate nationalist and populist, economic outlook that is, sometimes filtered badly through, the prism of his own bureaucracy, which is still largely globalist and focused on globalized economic conditions that aren't necessarily advantageous in the current form to the U.S. with enormous trade deficits. That no matter how much Trump might bluster and seek to dictate things through economic force, it is entirely uncertain whether this economic war, of tariffs and re-leveraging treaties is actually going to improve the conditions of blue-collar American workers, his base, as it were, feeding to his base. It's not sure that anything is going to help them at this point. They simply may be a dying breed, but at least Trump addressed the concerns, whereas other politicians, including others in the Republican and the Democratic Party candidate Hillary Clinton, simply ignored. They refused to recognize that anyone had suffered from globalization, which is just patently false. I mean, there are whole classes of people, particularly in the United States, but all over the world, that suffered, while others, particularly urbanized, educated elites, did extremely well out of the conditions. Trump is playing to his base with all of this, but it's not sure that this will actually do anything, or that anything can be done, to reverse that course.
Okay, gentlemen, we're going to leave it there at that for this segment, but of course appreciate both of your insights. That was Mark Sleboda, International Affairs and Security Analyst, speaking to us live from Moscow in Russia, and we were also joined by Einar Tangen, who is speaking to us live from Beijing in China, and he is a political and economic affairs commentator. As both of the gentlemen viewers mentioned, of course, this may very well be an issue of Trump wanting to put his own trademark, or his own name, I should say, upon these different relationships, these important relationships, be it a trade relationship with China, or just a security or military relationship with Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine or otherwise. We'll continue this conversation, though, after this short break. Welcome back, everyone. You're still in The Scope, and I'm Waqar Rizvi. We're continuing our discussion about the G20 summit in Argentina. In this segment, we have guests joining us from the United States. We're joined by Michael Lane, who is the founder of the American Institute of Foreign Policy, and we're joined from Germany by Dr. Christian Bluth, who is the project manager at program Megatrends of Bertelsmann Stiftung. Christian and Michael, thank you both for joining us. Christian, I'll start with you, if I may. When you look at the issue of trade as a whole and how it's played out right now on the sidelines of the G20, what do you make of it? Because on one hand, we have the row with China and the United States, and on the other, we have this new NAFTA that has been signed.
The German presidency last year didn't really do much on the issue. They wanted to avoid the controversy, but I don't think that will work anymore. We are seeing a rise of new protectionism. We have been seeing this for a couple of years, but 2018 has really been a year where the trend has been broken, and we have protectionist measures this year than any other year before. So this goes beyond actually the US-China controversy, but that's the most visible part. So I think it's really important that leaders address this challenge of new protectionism and reaffirm the liberal, multilateral, rules-based trade order.
And Michael, what do you make of that? Because, you know, the word protectionism is something that even China has used, and BRICS countries, in fact, made a statement as well going into this G20. It's warning the world of any protectionist trends. What do you make of that, Michael?
I believe that where we're at this particular point in the discussion is that the reason, or one of the reasons, that the G20 summit is really taking a backseat to all the sideline meetings is because of all the sideline issues that have developed over the last year and a half of the Trump presidency. The economic status of the world is pretty strong. It's going very, very well. But looming on the horizon, of course, is the ultimate impact or effect of what we get in the as a result of the various tariffs that President Trump has put on. So let's go through maybe a couple of them. In terms of his playing hardball with both Canada and Mexico by tossing aside the North American Free Trade Agreement in favor of new negotiations appears to have paid off. All sides seem very, very happy with the USMCA, and as a result of that, we'll probably have a better trilateral trade basis and a stronger economy between all those. But still looming large and probably to be resolved tonight is, of course, the circumstances surrounding the U.S. trade position and the various tariffs that have been leveled on China. This is something that is actually relatively non-controversial in the United States. Pretty much both major political parties, are very much in favor of the sanctions and the tariffs against China, even if they're not in favor of the ones against the European Union and our North American trading partners.
Michael, let me pick up on that point you just made, because I want to put that to Christian. Christian, as Michael there just pointed out, people within the United States pretty much say that China has been practicing unfair trade, especially with the United States. Do you think that there is some legitimacy to that argument?
I think there is, actually. We conducted, and I don't think this concerns the US only, we conducted a survey earlier this year where actually in most of the countries that we surveyed, the population said that increased trade with China is not going to help them. So China does a couple of things that actually distort the market mechanism pretty heavily. That's the strong role of state-owned enterprises. But it also is things like insufficient guarantee, or some people would even say a theft of intellectual property. So I think these are important issues that need to be addressed. So far, the Chinese have been not very willing to come forward and really change their proposition. So I think the G20 summit is sort of an important moment where the international community can put pressure on the Chinese to make them realize that they need to change some of their policies, or otherwise they're going to damage the international trading system.
All right, so I'm wondering, Christian, when we look at Europe and how it's looking at all of this occurring, we have obviously also the Russia-Ukraine clash, as well, as you well know, and we've had Russia sanctioned over the entire Ukraine issue by Europe, by the United States and others. How do you think all of this is affecting European economy, the European trade with all of the above, be it China, be it Russia, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, European sanctions vis-a-vis Russia have been in place for a couple of years now. So I think whatever effect they have, we have already seen that. So there's not going to be much of a new or accelerated effect, neither in Europe nor in Russia. So economically, I don't think that the escalation of the security situation.
But to be fair, Christian, if I may just come in, I apologize for interrupting you, because
of course.
I believe that gas, obviously, the Russian gas is extremely important for Europe, isn't it? So that does have quite a significant impact on the Europeans, does it not?
It would certainly if Russians decided to limit or cut off the gas supply or oil supply. But in previous crises, they have never done this. So it would be very surprising if they did this time.
All right, so let's talk about political will then for a moment, Christian. When it comes to these things about trade and how we're talking about it now, as I mentioned to Michael, the BRICS countries also released that statement saying that protectionism is not the way to go, warning about protectionism in the world. We also have, other major players at this G20 summit warning of that. Do you think that the world is moving, whether we want it or not, towards a protectionist trend?
I think we have very, very clear data on this. Just last week, a report was published by the Global Trade Alert that shows that really the number of protectionist measures implemented by countries worldwide, so this is not just the US, has really skyrocketed. It's a frightening number. So these measures are actually not tariffs, most of them, but behind the border issues. So these can be subsidies or other, practices that distort the market. Mm-hmm. And then this is where this joins the US-China issues, because the Chinese practice of subsidies is also one that the US government criticizes very heavily. But this is something that not only China does, and also the European Union wants to put this kind of practice on the policy agenda. And I think this is a very valid point to talk about.
Okay, so for those of us who are not experts like you, Christian, I want you to just put in a context for us. What does protectionism mean for consumers, for the daily lay people like myself who's out in the markets buying products? What does this mean for me?
Sure. I think the important thing to bear in mind is that protectionism doesn't actually protect. Protectionism is not helping consumers because it makes goods much more expensive. You have, if you have additional tariffs or non-tariff barriers that are costly to companies, that will make the end product for consumers more expensive. But you might argue that maybe workers or domestic companies of a protectionist country benefit. But that is actually not the case, because all it really does is prevent for some time the market exit of inefficient companies or inhibits innovation. And then it looks like it's going fine for a while, but then after a while you do see that these companies are actually no longer competitive. And then you have the negative effects that policymakers try to prevent with protectionist instruments even harsher. So protectionism doesn't protect.
Okay, so Michael, what do you make of these warnings of protectionism? I imagine, Michael, that even though many in the United States seem to be united in having a new trade pact, or however we want to look at it, with China, that no consumer within the United States, no voter base would be okay with their products and their markets becoming more expensive as a result of that.
No, actually, the barriers to trade are popular only in very narrow circles in the United States. For instance, if you happen to be a steel worker, you would be very much in favor of the steel tariffs because it takes away the international economic pressures on your company, and your company, you will actually do quite well. But other than that, the tariffs are not popular. Not widely supported in the United States, and so we'll take three of them at once. The first is the North American tariffs that were imposed. President Trump, I'm not going to say he got lucky. Maybe he got very, very, very good at it. But the bottom line is it was resolved fairly favorably, and I think people are happy that trade that trade relationship between the three countries is back on track, and the tariffs are likely to be taken off very soon. Conversely, we talked a little bit about China, where they're very, very popular. They believe that China is guilty on any number of counts of international trade violations, and they're willing to suffer through tariffs as a result of, as a side byproduct of trying to correct China's behavior.
And that's the point. I apologize for interrupting you, Michael, but that's in fact the point that I wanted to clarify. What I meant to ask you was specifically about the China issue, because again, China, as we know, sells a number of products, of course, to the United States, a large number of products, I should say, in fact, to the United States. They flood the American market, in fact, and they're a lot cheaper, I believe, from what I've researched, than any other alternatives that may exist. So do you think that the American consumer will be okay going into a store and buying something that's significantly more expensive than a Chinese version would be?
Well, okay with it is sort of a broad term. So far, as far as the American consumer is concerned, higher prices at the retail level have not really shown up in the United States. Mm-hmm. There are a number of companies that are not doing all that well, particularly auto companies that are in a situation where they're paying a lot more, particularly for steel, than they otherwise would. But those prices have only been inching up at the retail level in the United States, and so far consumers are not resistant to where it's at. If it becomes quite obvious that prices are going up measurably, and or some products are not available because China was a sole supplier or something like that, mm-hmm. Then in the future we will see more of a consumer backlash. But it really hasn't shown up as of this point. The third area that I just mentioned and touch on very, very briefly is the tariffs against the European Union. And those, of course, are not widely supported and are not widely popular in the United States. So we'll see where that goes. But vis-a-vis the consumer goods we get from China, so far, so good. But it depends on how long it goes on.
Okay, so let's talk about the tariffs on the European Union for a moment, Christian. What do you think the Europeans at this point are thinking going forward? That hasn't seemingly, at least, the issue of the tariffs on the European Union haven't overshadowed the G20 right now, because we're basically talking about the China issue mostly. But that's an important issue, I imagine, for the European Union, for any of the European leaders at the G20. What exactly do you think is happening behind the scenes vis-a-vis negotiations on those tariffs?
Well, obviously the European Union is not happy about the tariffs, but there are ongoing talks between the US government and the European Commission on some sort of trade deal that would address some of the concerns. Those talks have been going on for a while, but I think what we hear is that the Trump administration isn't happy with the progress of these talks. And that can be particularly dangerous for Europe because, and for Germany in particular, should the US government levy additional tariffs on German cars, that is something that would hurt not only the German car industry, but the German economy as a whole pretty badly. So I don't know whether this will be something to be discussed on the sidelines of the G20 summit. Mm-hmm. But I think there is a big fear on the German and on the European side that the Americans will lose their patience with the Europeans and they will want to avoid any drastic reactions from the US side.
Okay, so Michael, in the previous pair of guests that I had in the previous segment on this same topic, used the term economic warfare. Do you believe the United States is currently involved in economic warfare? Because, looking at from the outside in, when you look at a number of these measures that Donald Trump specifically has taken ever since he's come into office, be it vis-a-vis China, be it vis-a-vis the European Union, or even the sanctions as a whole against Russia over Ukraine, a lot of people would say that does very much seem like economic warfare. How would you respond to that, Michael?
Warfare is, again, one of those terms that we'd really have to define it before I could definitely answer that question. We're certainly in a very intense and robust economic competition with some of our with some of our trading partners. Whether that rises to the level of warfare, I suppose that each side may even have a different answer to that. What the president is trying to do is to correct almost 50, 60, 70 years of bad trade practice as he sees it in the United States. We've had the biggest, the strongest, the most robust, the most healthy economy for much of that time. And so Trump's predecessors have always sort of looked at it, well, we can give away just a little bit in terms of an even trading relationship because we can afford to do so, and it's in our interest to have a worldwide trading system of which the United States is a big part. Well, you can do that with one, maybe two trading partners, but when you do it with every trading partner that you have, you wind up with the situation where President Trump decided that the United States was almost uniformly disadvantaged across the entire world. And one of his campaign promises was to correct that. Well, that's what he's engaged in now, is an effort to correct that. The Europeans may consider it to be a trade war, but I'm sure President Trump looks at it only as corrective action designed to level the playing field for the United States versus each of its trading partners throughout the world. I suspect at the end, when the, quote, peace treaty is signed, that Trump will not get everything he wants, but he will get a major portion of what he's looking for, and our trading partners will be happy to give what they finally wind up giving in the interest of getting the world trade situation back on track.
Christian, what do you make of that? Do you think that the United States President Donald Trump is taking corrective actions, or is this, for lack of a better term, economic warfare?
I'm not sure if I would call it warfare, but I think the consensus, at least on the European side, is that Trump is making unfair accusations. I mean, yes, there are differences in the tariff schedules. I mean, he has repeatedly made the point that U.S. car exports to Europe are subject to a tariff, whereas European car exports to the U.S. are not. But this is sort of corrected by other imbalances in the tariffs. So all in all, I think the European Union does not believe that the U.S. is in a disadvantaged position in bilateral trade. Nevertheless, I think there is a willingness on the European side to discuss the tariffs, and maybe, I mean, a couple of years ago there were discussions on the TTIP, a trade agreement between the US and the EU, and well, that was much more ambitious than just putting all tariffs to zero. But I think if something like a TTIP like that would reduce mutual tariffs or maybe harmonize them, that is something that Europeans would be willing to do, and that might help to de-escalate the situation.
Michael, I'm wondering what kind of pressure Donald Trump is under at this point from the business community, because I was reading a number of articles before we came for this recording, and a number of business leaders are quite nervous about the fact that the Chinese economy may be slowing down ever so slowly, but it's still slowing down to a significant enough extent that they're worried about business. And we also have, of course, Michael, as you well know, Europe seemingly at least standing by its end of the bargain in the Iran nuclear deal, trying to see and find pathways to still trade with Iran. What does that all say to you, do you think?
President Trump is under significant pressure from the American business community to resolve this in an expeditious manner. I believe that there are new studies starting to come out indicating that the United States economy, as robust and healthy as it is, has been tarnished a little bit as a result of the trade competition that we have with some of our most significant trading partners. The president is always of the opinion, hang in there just a little longer. Victory is just around the corner. It's all going to work out. and will be better and will be stronger, and every company will be able to make more money as a result of whatever new policies he's able to negotiate and put in place. Well, that's a very good argument, but at some point the companies are squeezed so hard that they can no longer absorb the increased costs as a result of the tariffs, and they have to pass it along, resulting in consumer reaction to it. Or the second thing is that the companies themselves, just start to do less prosperously economically. We are fast approaching the point where the president needs to show some signs of progress, if not new agreements on the world stage, to be able to show the American people and the American business community that his strategy was the right one and that it's all going to work out in the end. I believe that time for him to show and demonstrate that progress is sooner rather than later. If we're still sitting here a year from now having this exact same discussion, then the president's policies have not produced what he's looking for, and I think they can be deemed a failure.
Okay, and then Christian, put in a context in the European business community, maybe thinking, what are experts like you thinking about this trade war, if I may use that term at this point, be it between Europe and the United States, or China and the United States, or even, if we may, Russia and the United States?
Well, I think that it is fair to say that they are worried, especially should it come to any tariffs on the power industry. But I think sort of looking at the records of Donald Trump's trade policy and previous trade conflicts that he has brought to escalation, the business community is a little more, well, at ease now, because when he renegotiated the trade agreement with Korea or renegotiated NAFTA, actually the changes that were made were not absolutely radical. There were changes, and they did not necessarily lead to much more open markets and trade integration, but they're not sort of dramatic, disruptive changes. So if that means that actually Donald Trump can be satisfied relatively easily by striking a new agreement that is not particularly disruptive, then that seems a route that many governments and the business community would probably be happy to travel on.
And Christian, I wanted to ask you, in fact, about Europe's point of view when to the Iran nuclear deal, because at least the way that the Iranians see it and the way that the Iranians say that the Europeans keep giving them guarantees that they will remain with that deal. Obviously issues of trade come up there as well, and the entire relationship, economic relationship too, with the United States comes into play for Europe in that case. How do you view that going forward?
Well, I think if it really comes to a test, and the US will sanction any company that does deals with Iran, German or European companies will be very clear that the bigger market is the US, and they will need to yield to that pressure. Also because the indemnization package that the EU has put in place would not be very easy to handle. So I think that actually here the US has the much stronger hand, and the European side has an interest to maintain the deal with the Iranian government, and they're not publicly going to distance themselves from it. But what we're going to see on the company level is probably that they'll yield to US pressure.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to leave it there at that, but appreciate both of you taking your time out of your busy schedules to speak to us here in The Scope. That was Dr. Christian Bluth speaking to us live from Germany. He's program manager with program Megatrends at Bertelsmann Stiftung. And we were also joined by Michael Lane, speaking to us live from the United States. He's the founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy. As both gentlemen there mentioned, viewers, of course, this issue of trade and the United States' point of view on it ever since Donald Trump has come into office is a complex one in the sense that with China, as Michael had mentioned in one of his answers, both parties and most people are on the side of Donald Trump in ensuring that China's quote-unquote unfair trade practices are checked. On other cases, such as with the European Union or even possibly this new NAFTA, there are concerns. So we'll of course have to see how all of this plays out, but obviously all of this has overshadowed that G20 summit in Argentina. We'll keep a very close eye on that, but thanks for watching. This has been Scope, and I've been Waqar Rizvi.